he decided to give the storm goddess a pair of eyes. She already had some eyes, of course. He'd carved them, after all. But that was just it. They were carved. However diligently he sandpapered them, they would never acquire the glossy surface of a living creature's eye. He had often thought of using glass. In fact, he'd even procured some glass balls for that purpose. But what was the use? If he simply gouged out 2 sockets and inserted them, the figurehead would goggle like a dead fish. Better to carve her some eyelids and insert the glass balls from the inside. Well, why not? Jacob Adams enlarged the hole in the underside of the storm goddess's head and chiseled away her wooden eyes, leaving the eyelids intact. Then he inserted 2 glass balls from the inside and cemented them in place. He did this with the greatest care, since no seawater could be allowed to seep in. And then he had another idea. A practical idea this time. Once he had glued the head to the body, no air would penetrate the cavity. Unable to dry out, the unseasoned timber would rot. The cavity had to be treated in some way. Anyone who had deposited 5 gold doubloons on Jacob Adams' workbench was entitled to a figurehead that would last for many years. Jacob used salts of mercury for preserving timber, an expensive but effective method. He dissolved 3½ ounces of the chemical in a bucket of water, turned the head upside down, and poured the solution into the cavity. The next day he emptied out the liquid that had not soaked into the timber, dried the cavity as best he could, and cemented the head onto the plug, first smearing the joint between the neck and the body with glue. Then he gave the head several coats of paint. No one would be able to detect that the head and the body hadn't been carved from a single piece of timber. Last of all, Jacob painted the eyes, whites, irises, and pupils. He felt sure that the paint would adhere to the glass for a long time to come. At least he hoped so. Then he stood back and surveyed his handiwork. The storm goddess gazed at him boldly and resolutely, with eyes as lustrous as those of a living creature. "You'll serve your purpose well," said Jacob Adams. Just how well, he never suspected. But that was later. Much later. 230 years later, to be precise. 1. Sunday lunchtime was always the worst. That was when every table in ye Olde Seashell Room was occupied, and customers stood in line outside the restaurant. As usual, they were mainly couples with little kids, Vicki noticed as she hurried to the serving counter with a tray. Vicki was 12. She liked little kids who didn't rampage around, upset their drinking glasses, and get ketchup all over the tablecloths. Unfortunately, there didn't seem to be any youngsters of that kind having lunch today. What there did seem to be was a secret telephone network via which all the seaside vacationers with little children had agreed to meet for Sunday lunch at ye Olde Seashell Room. "1 large, 1 small, and 2 kids on 12, said Vicki. Eileen gave her a nod and keyed in the order. A robust blonde, Eileen ran the restaurant and, ever since Vicki's parents had divorced, the household as well. Vicki's father, who was really the boss, was in charge of the kitchen. 1 large meant fillets of flounder with parsleyed potatoes and melted butter. 1 small was obvious, and kids meant fish sticks and French fries, and ketchup, which in turn meant that Vicki would later have to change the tablecloth. "Everything okay?" asked Eileen, and Vicki nodded. Eileen was cool. Vicki could go to her when she'd gotten a bad mark in math and didn't want Pop to know, or when she wanted to be shown how to apply nail polish, or even when she had problems with boys. Vicki scanned the restaurant. "Watch out for any customers trying to catch your eye," Eileen had told her. "Never look away, and at least give them a nod to show you've seen them." Vicki wasn't responsible for the whole restaurant, of course. Just 3 tables, to be exact. But they seemed to hold a magical attraction for families with little children. She only worked weekends during school vacations, and she couldn't afford to let it be known that her father paid her, or he'd be in trouble with the local authorities. All she'd done in the past was clear away the dirty plates. This summer vacation, for the first time, she'd been allowed to wait tables properly under Eileen's supervision. Vicki was big for her age, and heavily laden trays gave her no trouble. "Miss?" Vicki nodded and aimed a coming-right-away smile at table 12. The two kids, a girl and a boy, had started squabbling, but their glasses of juice were still upright. They were bored, and no wonder. Ye Olde Seashell Room held no appeal for little kids, even though there wasn't another place like it in the world. Almost every square inch of the spacious restaurant's walls was lined with seashells, large and small, smooth and fluted, white and colored, dull and shiny, round and elongated. Shells from the North Atlantic and the South Pacific, most of them from the latter, Vicki had discovered. Each of the shells had been cemented to the wall with its curved side facing outward. Huge clam shells, tiny mussel shells, middling-sized cowrie shells, and tropical cockle shells of all kinds. Vicki had looked up seashells in an encyclopedia. There were more than 6,000 kinds, and most of them seemed to be represented in Ye Olde Seashell Room. To quote the local tourist brochure, the restaurant was an attraction. And not only because of the seashells. There was also the carved wooden head on the end wall. Less of an attraction was the portrait of an 18th century sea captain hanging opposite it. Painted in oils, it didn't amount to much, from an artistic point of view. "One large, one small, and 2 fish sticks," said Vicki, unloading her tray. "Thanks," said the father. "Say, that head on the wall over there, who's it supposed to be?" "No one special. It comes from an 18th century figurehead. All we know is it belonged to a sailing ship named the Storm Goddess." "And the guy in the 3-cornered hat?" "That's the last captain of the Storm Goddess. She went down in a storm someplace off the coast near here." "Mom, I want a Coke." "Me too." "2 more orange juices," said the mother. 2 hours later, the restaurant was nearly empty. The Sunday afternoon coffee and pastries brigade would soon be turning up, but for the moment Vicki could relax. She did so leaning against the counter. "Never sit down," Eileen had told her. "If you absolutely must, catnap on your feet. Only waitresses in 5th-rate diners sit down." Vicki looked up at the figurehead. "Hi, Storm Goddess," she said, under her breath, of course. She didn't want anyone thinking her strange, but the Storm Goddess was a favorite of hers. Vicki found the seashells interesting, the captain too, but the head on the wall really fascinated her. The Storm Goddess's head had been mounted on a kind of slanting base, so that she leaned forward and looked down into the restaurant. But she didn't just look down, she looked straight at you. The Storm Goddess was looking at Vicki, gazing sternly into her eyes as if guarding certain secrets, one of which Vicki knew. As a little girl, she'd thought that the Storm Goddess's gaze was meant for her alone, and that it followed her all around the room. This scared her until Pop mentioned that the figurehead seemed to be looking at him, too. It was due to a peculiarity of the eyes. The Storm Goddess had a squint. It was only a slight squint, and you wouldn't have noticed it unless you looked very carefully. Above all, you couldn't tell why she was squinting, not from floor level. Vicki had found this out by chance. They'd been hanging up some decorations for Christmas, and a big ladder had been leaning against the wall beside the Storm Goddess. Although Vicki's father had strictly forbidden her to climb it, she'd done so while no one else was around. That was when she discovered that some of the paint had flaked off the Storm Goddess's right eye, just beside the black pupil. She also saw that the eye was made of glass. Vicki had told no one of her discovery. It had remained a secret between her and the Storm Goddess. She looked up at the head on the wall, and the head returned her gaze. The Storm Goddess looked down at her gravely as if to say, "I've other secrets in store." It was true. For instance, why did she have only a head? Figureheads were carved from a single piece of timber, but after the storm had sunk the ship, all that the waves had washed ashore was a head without a torso. What had happened on board? Why had the head become detached from the body? The history of the town, a big fat tome preserved in the public library, contained an account of the hurricane that had raged in the fall of 1772. However, all it said about the head was that it had been found on the beach and identified as belonging to the Storm Goddess. Also reported to have been washed up at the same time was a packet wrapped in sailcloth and waterproofed with pitch. What had the packet contained?